The year was 1769. Not much was happening in the town of Ajaccio, Corsica, except that a baby named Napoleon Bonaparte was about to make a quiet entrance into the world. He did not enter with a thunderclap. No prophecies, no glowing stars, just a regular birth in a regular house. The air was mild, slightly breezy, perhaps. People were probably wearing wool. The house where Napoleon was born wasn't large. It wasn't fancy either. It was the kind of house that creaked when people walked upstairs and got chilly in the winter. There were likely herbs drying in the kitchen and maybe a cat or a goat or possibly both. The furniture was functional, the walls were thick. It had a front door, a back door, and a view of the street. That was about it. Inside the house, Napoleon's mother, Letizia Ramalino, was doing something fairly intense, giving birth to her fourth child. She would go on to have 13 children in total, so at this point she was not new to the whole process, but it still probably wasn't fun. Childbirth in the 18th century was a no-frills event. There were no painkillers, no birth playlists, just towels, midwives, and maybe someone boiling water in the background, because that's what people always seem to do. Letizia was strong. She came from a Corsican noble family and had grown up knowing how to manage things: children, household finances, meals, and the occasional French invasion. It's safe to assume she was exhausted but composed. After all, she had other kids to feed. Napoleon was born with all the usual features: a head, arms, legs, and a face that probably looked a little grumpy. Newborns tend to look like that. There's no way to confirm whether he cried loudly or just squinted at everyone like he was already disappointed in the world, but either seems fitting. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was present, or at least nearby. Carlo was a lawyer and a minor nobleman. By minor nobleman, we mean someone who had a title, but not much land or power to go with it. He did his best to provide for the growing family. This mostly meant studying legal books and writing letters in very neat handwriting. He also worked closely with the new French rulers, a job that involved meetings, small talk, and paperwork. Now, Corsica had recently become French territory. Just a year before Napoleon's birth, France had taken control of the island from the Republic of Genoa. People had feelings about that. There were long discussions, probably over wine and olives, where older men shook their heads and said, "This will never last," while younger men shrugged and said, "Maybe it's not so bad." The Bonaparte family had originally supported Corsican independence, but Carlo, ever the practical man, adapted to the French presence with quiet acceptance. He was a realist, or maybe just tired. It was hard to tell. In the Bonaparte household, things were rarely quiet. Napoleon had 3 older siblings already. He would eventually have 7 more. That's a lot of noise. A lot of clattering dishes, running feet, shared beds, and arguments over who stole whose bread. But somehow the family managed. Napoleon, despite being small, wrinkly, and entirely unaware of his future as an emperor, began to grow. Slowly, like babies do. He learned to grip fingers, make small grunts, and blink at candlelight. His early life was made up of blankets, lullabies, and the occasional goat wandering too close. Corsica itself was a rocky, sunlit island with hills, olive trees, and stone villages. People farmed, fished, and herded animals. Some fought in small political skirmishes, but most just went about their days. The roads were dusty. The sea was blue. Life moved at a pace that was neither fast nor slow, just steady. In this setting, Napoleon's first few years unfolded without much incident. He ate soft food. He was wrapped in cloth. He was held by aunts and cousins. His name, Napoleon, was a fairly common one in Corsica at the time. No one thought too much of it, at least not yet. Letizia raised her children with a firm hand and a sharp eye. She didn't spoil them. There wasn't much to spoil them with anyway. She made sure they were dressed, fed, and respectful. Carlo encouraged education. He was especially proud when one of the children could recite Latin phrases or spell long words without help. Napoleon, as he got older, showed signs of being serious, maybe too serious. He didn't always want to play. He stared at people a lot. He preferred sitting in corners with books or staring out windows. No one called him fun, but he was rarely in trouble either. The town of Ajaccio wasn't large. Everyone knew everyone. If someone bought too much cheese, people noticed. If someone's horse limped, word got around. It was that kind of town. There were festivals, markets, church on Sundays, and long, slow afternoons when nothing much happened. Napoleon learned to walk on stone floors. He learned to speak in a Corsican dialect that blended Italian and French. His first words were likely practical. Things like bread, no, or goat. It's not recorded, but it's a safe guess. As the years passed, the Bonaparte house became more crowded. New babies arrived. Beds were shared. Meals were stretched. Carlo worked harder, trying to secure scholarships and favor with French officials. He wanted opportunities for his sons. He wrote letters to Paris, to regional leaders, to anyone who might help. He was polite in every one of them. Letizia, meanwhile, ran the house like a quiet commander. Napoleon watched her. It's said he admired her strength, her discipline, her ability to manage so much with so little. She rarely smiled, but when she did, it meant something. Sometimes visitors came. They drank coffee and spoke in low voices about politics and trade. Napoleon sat nearby and listened. Even as a child, he listened more than he spoke. By age 5, he could name every member of his family. That alone was a feat. He had older brothers named Joseph and Lucian. He had sisters named Elisa, Pauline, and Caroline, and younger siblings still to come. He had cousins and uncles and neighbors who might as well have been relatives. His world was full and noisy and warm. The family was not wealthy, but they weren't poor either. They had shoes. They had books. They had oil lamps and bread, but they did not have luxuries. Napoleon wore hand-me-downs. He ate what was cooked. He slept wherever there was space. Corsica itself stayed politically tense. The French flag flew from public buildings, but many Corsicans still felt more Corsican than French. There were arguments, debates, and songs about freedom. Most of it went over Napoleon's head, but he absorbed the atmosphere. His childhood was not dramatic. He was not a prodigy. He did not command armies from his crib. He grew like any other child, slowly, quietly, steadily. He learned to read. He learned to count. He learned how to sit still during long church services and how to avoid getting blamed when something broke. By the time he turned 9, he was ready to leave, not emotionally but logistically. A scholarship had been arranged, and he would be sent to mainland France for schooling. It was a big step for a small boy from an island town. But that part of the story comes later. For now, Napoleon was still just a Corsican baby who had turned into a Corsican boy, one of many children in a busy, modest home, surrounded by olive trees, sea winds, and the low hum of daily life. And at the end of most days, he probably went to bed early. Maybe he dreamed of soldiers. Maybe he just dreamed of bread. Napoleon Bonaparte was 9 years old when he left Corsica. It was the kind of departure that involved a small suitcase, a few tightly folded clothes, and probably some bread wrapped in cloth. He was going to school in France, a military school on the mainland. Far from home, the ship ride was long and probably a little seasick. He stood quietly on the deck, looking out at the sea, not smiling, just thinking. He was good at that. Some kids sang or played games. Napoleon stared at waves and imagined books he hadn't read yet. He arrived in mainland France and immediately noticed something. People spoke differently, not just fast, but French, real French, not the Corsican, French-Italian mix he was used to. He understood bits of it, but it didn't feel comfortable, like trying on a coat with too many buttons. He arrived at the school, Brienne-le Château. It was grey, the kind of grey you don't forget. The walls were high, the windows were tall, and the hallways echoed in the winter. The school was run by military officials, priests, and people who were very serious about quiet. Napoleon did not stand out, at least not at first. He was small, quiet, and had a strong accent. The other boys laughed at how he spoke. They called him names. He called them names back, mostly under his breath. He didn't like to fight, but he also didn't forget. The schedule at Brienne was strict. Wake up early, wash in cold water, march down hallways, sit in wooden chairs, read Latin, copy maps, drill math problems, eat soup, repeat. Napoleon was good at some of these things. He liked math. It made sense. It followed rules. He also liked history, especially stories about ancient leaders, battles, and sieges. He didn't care much for dancing, music, or small talk. He didn't have many friends. That wasn't unusual. He didn't try to make many either. He spent his free time reading, writing letters, or standing near windows thinking about strategy, even when there was nothing to strategize. He read Plutarch's Lives. He admired Caesar. He admired Alexander the Great. He admired order. Lunches were quiet. Napoleon chewed slowly, staring at his bowl like it might have answers in it. Sometimes it was vegetable stew. Sometimes it was something more mysterious. Either way, he ate everything. Over time, he began to rise, not socially. He wasn't popular, but academically and in discipline. He could march in a straight line. He could explain artillery placement. He could multiply quickly and name rivers on maps. He was focused and quiet, always quiet. He wrote long letters to his family in Corsica. Sometimes he complained. Sometimes he asked for money or books or warmer socks. Mostly, he just reported things in the same calm tone he used for everything else. Today, I studied fortifications. It snowed. I sneezed. There were holidays, of course. Short breaks when some boys went home. Napoleon rarely did. Corsica was far. Travel was expensive. He stayed behind, reading or walking the school grounds. It was fine. He didn't mind silence. His teachers noted that he was intelligent, serious, and a little moody. He was sometimes called the Little Corsican, which wasn't always meant kindly, but he kept his head down and studied more. He learned French more fluently over time, slowly, steadily, word by word. He stopped pronouncing certain letters the Corsican way. He started writing his name as Napoleon Bonaparte. It looked more French that way. By his early teens, Napoleon was already planning, not just his day or his homework, but his life. He saw how power worked, how France treated its nobility, how officers were promoted, how people listened to men who sounded like they knew what they were doing. So he worked at sounding like that. At 15, he was selected to attend the École Militaire in Paris, the elite military academy. Not everyone got in. He did, thanks to a scholarship and his performance in math. His father had helped secure it, writing to everyone he could think of. Sadly, his father passed away not long after. Napoleon was still in school. In Paris, everything was bigger, the buildings, the noise, the expectations. Napoleon arrived with one suitcase and very little money. His classmates were richer, fancier, and often had powdered wigs. He did not. He still preferred simple clothes and fewer conversations. At the École Militaire, the curriculum was intense but predictable. Geometry, artillery, history, fortifications, drawing, horse riding, even fencing, though Napoleon was only average at that. What he lacked in athletic skill, he made up for in focus. He studied harder than most. He read military manuals in bed. He memorized historical campaigns. He didn't waste time on parties, or gossip, or hobbies. By the age of 16, Napoleon graduated as a second lieutenant in the artillery. He was now officially a soldier, not a glamorous one, not a commander, just a young man in uniform with a long title and very little salary. He was sent to Valence, a town in southeastern France. There he spent his time in the barracks, organizing things, practicing drills, and still writing home. As a junior officer, Napoleon had a lot of time to himself, and he used it wisely, or at least consistently. He read, he wrote, he walked, he thought about politics, leadership, and maybe soup. He also wrote an essay on Corsican independence. It was a little rebellious, and the French government might not have liked it much. But at this point, he was still figuring out where he stood. Corsican patriot or loyal French officer, sometimes both. He didn't date, he didn't gamble, he didn't dance. His hobbies were military diagrams and staring at hills. He once described love as a stupid thing, which, while a bit dramatic, gives you a sense of his social life at the time. People around him noticed that he was different, not in an obvious way, but in that quiet, still waters run deep way. He was intense, focused, less interested in fun, more interested in maps. At age 17, while many boys his age were trying to grow beards or flirt with shopkeepers, Napoleon was reading Voltaire, studying battlefield formations, and thinking about how empires rise and fall. Just casual thoughts like that. He had big ideas. He just hadn't told anyone yet. And so Napoleon's schooling years came to an end, not with fireworks or a celebration, but with a soft closing of a book and a quiet walk across a parade ground. He wasn't famous, not yet. He was just a very serious young man with very straight handwriting and a head full of plans. By the time Napoleon Bonaparte was officially a second lieutenant in the French artillery, he was still very young. Just 17. Technically an adult, but emotionally still mostly books and boots. His job sounded important on paper, but in real life it mostly meant waiting around doing math and making sure cannonballs didn't roll away. His first post was in Valence, a quiet town with cobbled streets and lots of stone buildings that didn't do much. The town had some hills, some wind, and a handful of soldiers who took long walks and didn't cause too much trouble. Napoleon's living quarters were small, probably cold in the winter, and not especially decorated. He owned a few uniforms, a few books, a quill, and a deep commitment to not spending money on anything fun. He didn't drink much, he didn't party, he didn't collect anything, he didn't even write poetry, which was popular at the time. Instead, he read a lot. He read about everything: history, politics, warfare, philosophy. Especially the classics: Plutarch, Tacitus, Polybius, and the Enlightenment thinkers, Voltaire, Rousseau, Montesquieu. He scribbled notes in the margins. He read by candlelight. He forgot to eat sometimes. Or maybe he just ate bread while reading. In Valence, Napoleon developed a kind of routine. He woke up early. He drilled with other officers. He studied artillery manuals. He wrote letters to his family in Corsica. He walked alone along the river, sometimes with his hands behind his back, sometimes with a biscuit. He wrote a lot: journals, notes, essays, observations. Not all of it made sense, but most of it was serious. He liked writing about duty, honor, the state, and leadership. He liked lists. He didn't waste words. Even his handwriting looked organized. Occasionally he spoke to other officers, usually about military history, sometimes about Corsica, rarely about his feelings. Corsica was still on his mind. Even though he wore a French uniform, his identity was still tangled up in that island. He had grown up hearing the language of independence, of resistance. His father had been connected to Corsican revolutionaries. It stuck with him. At one point, Napoleon requested extended leave to return to Corsica. He had big ideas about helping his home island, possibly even leading it. He arrived full of theories and thoughts. Unfortunately, not everyone on the island shared his excitement. Corsican politics were messy, complicated, full of family rivalries and long grudges that went back decades, sometimes centuries. It was like a game of chess where half the pieces were goats and nobody remembered who was winning. Napoleon tried to get involved, but his manner didn't help. He had a way of speaking that sounded like he was always lecturing a classroom, even if he was just ordering coffee. The locals weren't impressed. He got into a bitter argument with Pasquale Paoli, the once revered Corsican leader whom Napoleon had admired since childhood, but now they didn't see eye to eye. Paoli didn't trust Napoleon. Napoleon thought Paoli was too old-fashioned. It ended badly. There were protests, rumors, possibly shouting. Napoleon and his family had to leave Corsica for good. It wasn't safe anymore. They had been marked as traitors, or at least as people who ruined the party. Back in France, Napoleon resumed his military service, but now he had even more reason to focus. He had no home to return to. He was Corsican by birth, but French by necessity. That left only one path forward: success. In France, in the army, preferably with cannons. In his early 20s, he bounced between garrisons and post, Soissons, Valence, Lyon. Each place had barracks, drills, paperwork, and a lot of standing in lines. Napoleon became increasingly precise. His reports were detailed, his recommendations well reasoned. His hair was still unruly, but his thinking was sharp. Officers took notice, not because he was charming he wasn't, or tall he wasn't that either, but because he knew things. His grasp of artillery theory was solid. His opinions about battlefield strategy were surprisingly insightful for someone who hadn't actually fought in a real war yet. Still, promotions were slow. The French army was clogged with noblemen who had bought their ranks and didn't really enjoy mud. Napoleon, being neither rich nor famous, had to wait his turn. In the meantime, he read even more. He studied Frederick the Great of Prussia. He analyzed Caesar's Gallic wars. He devoured anything he could find about Alexander the Great. It's possible he even imagined himself in those roles, not with pride, just as a thought experiment. He also read about governance, what makes a good leader, what makes a bad one, how laws are formed, how revolutions begin. He wasn't planning anything, not yet. He was just curious. During these years, Napoleon also started writing fiction. Yes, fiction. He wrote a novella called Clisson and Eugenie, a tragic love story about a sad soldier and his doomed romance. It was dramatic. It had longing. It was never published in his lifetime, probably for the best. While his literary career didn't take off, his military one was about to. In 1789, something happened in France, the Revolution. At first, Napoleon watched it from the sidelines. He was still a low-ranking officer. There were pamphlets, speeches, protests, bred riots. People talked a lot about liberty, fraternity, and equality. Napoleon, ever the observer, took notes. He agreed with some of it, not all. He believed in order, not chaos. He liked merit, not mobs. But he could also see that the old system, where birth mattered more than talent, was breaking down. And for someone like him, that could be a good thing. He wrote more. He started calling himself a Republican. He didn't yell about it. He just updated his vocabulary. In France, during a revolution, that's practically a political statement. As revolutionary France began to restructure itself, the army also changed. Many old officers, especially nobles, fled or were removed. Vacancies opened. Promotion became possible. Napoleon moved up. In 1792, he was promoted to captain. Not a huge jump, but enough to make things interesting. He started commanding more men, dealing with more logistics, and finally getting closer to real action. He was posted to the south of France, where tensions were high. Royalists were rising, revolutionaries were pushing back, cities were changing hands, people were confused. Napoleon was not confused. He understood artillery. He understood how cities could be taken, or defended using careful calculations, good angles, and plenty of cannonballs. In 1793 he got his big break. The city of Toulon, a major port, had fallen into royalist hands. With help from the British Navy, they were holding the port and resisting the revolutionary government. Napoleon, still young and barely known, was sent to assist in the siege. He made suggestions, he was ignored, then he made diagrams, then he insisted, eventually someone listened. Napoleon proposed a new artillery plan, strategic, precise, and unusual. It worked. The city was retaken. British ships left. The port returned to revolutionary hands. It was a solid win. Napoleon was promoted to brigadier general. That's a big leap. From an officer who mostly read books to someone who commanded real troops. In the space of a few weeks, he went from a name on a roster to a name people remembered. He was 24. The quiet artillery nerd from Corsica was now a general. It probably felt strange, but he didn't celebrate. He didn't throw a party or buy a new hat. He kept his usual coat. He kept reading. He probably marked the day with a short note in his journal and a very ordinary meal. Life would start to move faster now. More promotions, more attention, more assignments. But for a long time years, really Napoleon had simply been a young officer who read a lot, walked quietly, and imagined diagrams no one else could see. The future was coming, but for now he returned to his maps, and probably made tea. France, in 1789, was beginning to get a little uncomfortable, not immediately, not loudly, but a slow, creeping kind of discomfort. Like when your shoes don't quite fit, and you ignore it for a while, until suddenly you're limping through a full-blown revolution. People were unhappy. That much was clear. Bread was expensive. Taxes were confusing. The king was quiet and indecisive. The queen was glamorous and not very helpful. And most people, especially the ones who didn't live in palaces, were tired. Napoleon Bonaparte, now a quiet officer with decent handwriting, wasn't directly involved when things first kicked off. He was stationed in various places, mostly keeping to himself and calculating the ideal trajectory of cannon fire. Still, even in the far corners of the country, word spread. In Paris, people gathered in crowds and discussed ideas like liberty, equality, and maybe we don't need kings anymore. Pamphlets flew through the streets. Everyone was quoting Rousseau. The fashionable ones also quoted Voltaire. There was a lot of quoting. Then, on July 14th, 1789, the Bastille was stormed. It was a prison. Not a particularly full one, but it was a symbol of royal authority, so tearing it down felt meaningful. People cheered, others panicked. Nobles began packing bags. Out in the provinces, people weren't always sure what was happening. They just heard the word revolution and looked over their shoulders while holding their bread a little tighter. Napoleon, stationed in Auxonne or maybe Valence, depending on the month, watched quietly. He liked the idea of a republic, he liked merit, he liked structure, but he didn't like mobs or people making decisions without planning first. Spontaneity gave him hives. Over the next few years, France didn't exactly collapse, but it definitely reshuffled itself in dramatic and exhausting ways. The Estates General became the National Assembly. The king, Louis Roman XVI, agreed to share power, then changed his mind, then tried to escape in a carriage that didn't go well. A constitution was written, then rewritten, then set on fire metaphorically. The monarchy was abolished. The royal family was imprisoned. There were speeches, so many speeches. Napoleon, meanwhile, kept being a soldier. He took leave here and there, sometimes to visit his family, sometimes to make awkward political moves in Corsica, which we covered. But for the most part, he remained focused on his career, promotions, reports, logistics. It was what he understood. By 1792, things had escalated. The revolution had entered what historians would later describe as messy. France declared war on Austria, then Prussia. Then just about everybody. Armies were needed. Officers were needed. Suddenly, being experienced and loyal to the Republic meant something. Napoleon quietly aligned himself with the Jacobins, the more radical branch of the revolutionary government. He didn't wave flags or yell slogans. He just wrote supportive essays and nodded in meetings. Then, in 1793, King Louis Roman XVI was executed. It was a cold day. The guillotine was efficient. Crowds gathered. It was the kind of event you didn't forget, even if you tried. Napoleon's reaction is unknown, but he probably frowned, noted the weather, and got back to his maps. The revolution had now entered the reign of terror. This was not a metaphor. Thousands of people were arrested. Many were executed. All it took was someone accusing you of being against the revolution, and your neck might be introduced to a very sharp blade. Napoleon stayed quiet. He focused on work. He made himself useful. No grand speeches, no parades, just results. And results were what he delivered in Toulon, as we mentioned earlier. There, in 1793, he helped defeat the Royalists with a very practical use of artillery. It wasn't flashy, but it worked, and because of that, he became a brigadier general at just 24. This made people curious. Who's that short guy with the intense stare? They asked. Some Corsican kid who doesn't talk much but knows where to put the cannons, came the reply. Napoleon didn't argue. Back in Paris, things continued to swirl. Robespierre rose. Robespierre fell. Heads rolled. Alliances shifted. Paperwork piled up. Napoleon was briefly arrested, possibly for his connections, possibly out of caution, but was released a few days later. No one made a big deal of it. He returned to writing letters. In 1795, the revolutionary government faced another challenge. Royalists in Paris decided to march on the National Convention. The government needed someone to stop them. Someone quick, efficient, and not too chatty. They picked Napoleon. He accepted. He positioned cannons along the streets of Paris. He fired grapeshot into the advancing crowd. It was loud. It was brutal. It was effective. He later called it a whiff of grapeshot. A poetic understatement, really. Hundreds were killed. The uprising ended before it truly began. The government was grateful. Napoleon was promoted again. He was now in charge of the Army of the Interior. Just like that, he went from background artillery guy to person you call when things go sideways. The revolution, by now, had settled into what was called the Directory, a 5-man executive committee that governed France with varying levels of enthusiasm and success. Napoleon didn't love the Directory, but he worked with it. He didn't care much who ruled France, as long as they let him do what he was good at: planning, organizing, winning. He was now known in military circles. He had uniforms that actually fit. He had confidence in public, even if he still preferred silence. He also had fans. People started writing about him in newspapers. Soldiers liked him. He was one of them, just cleaner and more organized. Somewhere in the middle of this, he met Josephine de Beauharnais. She was elegant. She was older. She was widowed. She was connected. Napoleon was awkward. He wrote long, dramatic love letters filled with sentences like, "I awake filled with you." She read them politely. They got married anyway. It was a practical match, with just enough affection to hold it together, for now. By the end of 1795, France had a very different political system than it did in 1789. The king was gone. Nobles were gone. Many things were broken, but a few things had held up. One of those things, quietly holding steady, was Napoleon. He had watched a monarchy collapse, a republic rise, and several governments lose their grip, all without raising his voice. He had survived revolutions, political purges, duels of ideology, and several arguments over lunch. And now he was about to be sent somewhere else, somewhere with heat, sand, camels, and, most importantly, more opportunities. But that's for the next chapter. For now, the French Revolution had happened. and Napoleon had calmly walked through it with a map in one hand and a telescope in the other. Toulon, a warm port city on the southern coast of France, where the sea sparkles, the fish markets smell like ambition, and in the year 1793 things were very not calm. The revolution was still in progress, but like a badly managed bakery, things were already burning. Royalists, supporters of the monarchy, had taken control of Toulon and handed it over to the British Navy for safekeeping, which, as you can imagine, was not a popular move with the new French Republic. The government needed the port back, fast. Toulon wasn't just pretty, it was important. It was home to a big chunk of the French fleet, and if they lost the fleet, they could lose the war. Enter Napoleon Bonaparte, age 24, recently promoted, still a little moody, but now with a decent coat and a general's title. He wasn't the lead commander of the siege, not yet, but he was in charge of the artillery, which, at that point in history, was kind of like being the guy who controls the sound system at a concert. If you did your job right, nobody noticed, but if you did it wrong, everything fell apart. When Napoleon arrived at Toulon, the siege was already dragging. French forces had surrounded the city, but progress was slow, very slow, like maybe we should just go home, slow. Napoleon looked around, he inspected the hills, he asked questions. Then he pointed to a ridge overlooking the city and said something like, "If we put guns there, we win." Everyone blinked. That Hill à la Galette was lightly defended but extremely important. If the French could capture it, they could aim their cannons at the port, force the British fleet to flee, and make the royalists inside the city rethink their life choices. Napoleon drew up a plan. He mapped out where to place batteries, how to supply them, and how many shots to fire per minute. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't poetic, but it was precise. Then he did the part that most officers skipped. He supervised it himself. Every cannon, every sandbag, every shovel of dirt. He barely slept. He rarely smiled. He muttered a lot, probably about angles and friction. And slowly the French artillery began to work. Boom, boom. Boom, the cannons started pounding British positions, not wildly, not at random, with calculation. Napoleon made sure the shots were aimed with intention, each one part of a long, invisible equation in his head. British ships began to move. Royalist soldiers inside the city began to panic, and the higher-ranking French commanders started to say things like, "Who is that guy again?" Napoleon didn't answer. He just kept giving orders and adjusting coordinates. Eventually, the French forces launched an assault on the key forts, including Fort Mulgrave, nicknamed Little Gibraltar, because it was a pain to take. Napoleon was there, directing fire, dodging bullets, and possibly yelling, though no one remembers him as much of a yeller. He was injured in the leg during the fighting, not a serious wound, just enough to remind him that battle is loud and dangerous, and occasionally messy. But Toulon fell, the British sailed away, the Royalists fled or surrendered, and the French Republic kept its fleet. It was a huge win. Napoleon, once the young man who no one invited to dinner, was now a national hero, at least in military circles. And more importantly, people in Paris were talking about him. He was promoted again, Brigadier General officially. He was 24. Let's take a quiet moment to appreciate this. Most 24-year-olds at the time were barely getting their first good boots. Napoleon was now commanding artillery on behalf of a revolutionary government, with a war on multiple fronts and an extremely complicated political situation. Did he celebrate? Probably not. Did he write about it in a journal using intense metaphors? Almost definitely. But Napoleon's rise wasn't just about one battle. It was about how he fought it, not with brute strength, but with planning, with precision, with an almost irritating level of detail. That's what made him different. After Toulon, Napoleon briefly returned to civilian life, if you can call sitting alone in a modest apartment reading military manuals civilian life. He was assigned to the army of Italy, but he didn't go right away. There were more political debates to wade through, more uniforms to tailor, and probably more letters to write to his mother. Then, for a moment, his luck wobbled. After the fall of Robespierre, one of Napoleon's political patrons, he was briefly arrested. No charges, just suspicion. Being associated with the wrong people at the wrong time could be dangerous. But, as always, Napoleon kept his cool. He explained his value. He reminded people that he had just saved a major French port. And he got out, no harm done, just a reminder that in revolutionary France, staying alive was also a skill. And then came another turning point, October 1795. There was unrest in Paris again. Royalists had decided to stage an uprising against the new government. They were marching on the Tuileries Palace with real weapons and real anger. The government needed someone to stop them. They called Napoleon. He didn't hesitate. He positioned cannons along the streets of Paris, strategically placed to block the advance. He used grape shot, basically a big shotgun blast from a cannon, very messy, very effective. The crowd didn't stand a chance. In a matter of minutes, the insurrection was crushed. People were stunned. No long speeches, no negotiations, just math and iron. Napoleon referred to it later as giving the crowd a whiff of grape shot. That phrase would follow him for the rest of his life. The government was extremely pleased. He had saved the capital, again. This time they didn't just thank him, they gave him a real assignment. Napoleon Bonaparte, now a full general, was given command of the army of Italy, an underfunded, underfed, and underperforming group of soldiers fighting in the Alps. It didn't sound glamorous, but Napoleon didn't need glamour. He needed opportunity, and that's what he was about to get. He would soon step into Italy with a map, a telescope, and a very big plan. But that's next chapter. For now, let's leave him standing in the streets of Paris, just after the uprise, in quiet, calculating, and completely unshaken. The little Corsican officer who placed his cannons just right. It was December 1795 in Paris. The air was cold, a little damp, and the city felt tense. People were walking the streets bundled in wide coats and woolen scarves. The lamps glowed early. Everything seemed grey and quiet. But beneath the quiet, things were stirring. Royalists, supporters of the old monarchy, were unhappy with the new government, the Directory. They gathered in groups. They talked about restoration. They planned to march on the Tuileries Palace, where the national government met. Their mood wasn't festive, it was serious, threatening. Paris was restless, a little scared. The government couldn't let it happen again. Enter Napoleon Bonaparte, age 20, 6 now, standing quietly in uniform. He'd already put down one uprising in Toulon with careful artillery strategy. Now he was asked to handle another in the capital itself. The order was clear: stop the royalists from taking over. The tool, cannon fire. How calm would it be? Very calm, like boiling water before it bubbles. Eventually it bubbles. Napoleon moved fast. He examined the streets. He walked along broad boulevards. He looked at corners. He calculated angles. He consulted maps. He asked quietly, where would they march from? Which streets are narrow? Which open squares could be used to place artillery? Then he placed cannons along narrow streets, facing plazas. Behind buildings, on corners, anywhere they would channel the crowd. He used grape shots, small metal balls packed in a canvas bag, fired from a cannon like a giant shotgun blast. It's not subtle, but placed well, it's efficient. He didn't give inflammatory speeches. He just said, press the trigger when I tell you. Then he waited. When the royalists advanced, they did not expect resistance. Yet there they were, silent cannons bristling at intersections. The march slowed, confusion spread, then came the blasts, not dozens, maybe just a few volleys, enough to stop momentum, enough to scatter people. Chaotic scenes followed, shouts, people ducking, some injured, many frightened, but no draw, nout siege, no cannonballs flying for hours, just a few precise bursts, and the royalists withdrew. Napoleon walked through the streets afterward. There were some grim faces, silenced groups of protesters, some blood on the cobbles, but also relief, quiet whispers. He did it. It was quick. It was calm. The Directory was impressed. The army was impressed. And Parisians, relieved by a mix of fear and gratitude, saw him differently. In one stroke, Napoleon became a national figure. Newspapers quietly ran his name. Officers mentioned him. Soldiers whispered stories. He was no longer the Corsican officer. He was the general who defended Paris. A hero, softly spoken but powerful, and then came something new, a promotion. He became commander of the Army of the Interior, the force responsible for keeping Paris itself safe from uprisings, royalist plots, or any loud parties that should not happen. He was 26. He now wore a uniform with power tied to it. His orders counted. His face appeared in official messengers. His voice, when he used it, carried weight. It sounds dramatic, but nothing about Napoleon was dramatic. Not yet. He was still calm, quiet, methodical. He wrote orders in neat handwriting. He inspected barracks. He trained artillery crews. He reported daily. He did this so consistently that people expected it. Solid work, quiet tone, results. During this time, Napoleon also met Josephine de Beauharnais. She was William Joseph's widow. His husband had died during the Revolution. She was fashionable, elegant, older than Napoleon by some years. And she had connections in Parisian society. Their first meeting was not fireworks. It was polite, slightly awkward. He in his uniform, her in a dress with a widow's lace. Someone introduced them. They talked about politics, art, and war. Possibly the weather. He watched her hands. She listened politely. Then she smiled a little. They parted. Napoleon wrote letters afterward. His style, dramatic, over the top in sentiment, but contained in neat lines. I awake filled with you. You are in my thoughts always. She wrote back, polite but reserved, enough to keep him hopeful. They talked more over dinners at her place. She had a small circle of friends. He was invited sometimes. He was awkward. He didn't smile a lot. He joked infrequently, but he listened intently. Over weeks they saw each other more. Still, life for Napoleon was mostly work. From his office he looked at maps of Paris, surveyed the city's defenses, refined regulations for the militia, and gave tours to foreign diplomats who visited for security briefings. He rarely laughed. He occasionally watered his horse in the courtyard, but behind his mild manner something shifted. He felt more confident. He sensed influence. He noticed that even ministers listened when he spoke. People began to ask him advice, not just about cannons, but about order, logistics, and troop morale. He gave them simple answers, strategic, calm, in businesslike paragraphs. All of this while maintaining a steady personal routine, early mornings, inspection of city gates, guard duty briefings. Afternoon, paperwork, letters, and occasional lectures on artillery. Evening, dinner, brief notes to Josephine, reading books, often Plutarch or Rousseau, before bed. Weekends, brief visits to her residence or short walks along the Seine, noting reflections on the water and the quiet feeling of control. Paris continued to experience political shifts. The Directory had weaknesses. Economic instability, political squabbles, rumors of corruption. But Napoleon held firm. He wasn't part of the council. He was the protector of the city. In public events, he wore a coat of dark blue, trimmed with brass buttons, and kept his posture straight but relaxed. He was neither tall nor especially handsome, but he had a presence, quiet, like a still lake. He didn't publicize his romance with Josephine. If letters leaked, they did so quietly in salons. Some said he was obsessed. Others said he was foolish to marry a widow with debts. He didn't mind gossip. By late 1796, the city was stable. The political temperature had dropped. The threat of royalist uprisings faded, but Napoleon's moment was fading too. If he stayed in Paris much longer, he'd become known but not tested in the field. He wanted the field, he wanted results, and he knew quiet achievements must follow action eventually. So the Directory agreed he would be sent to the Italian front, not as a glorified hero, but as a test. A chance to show what he could do beyond Paris. Before departing, he visited Josephine one last time in the city. They spoke softly. He said, "I go to Italy. I will write you every day." She smiled. He left. And so ends the chapter where Napoleon quietly became a national hero, calmed a violent crowd with a few precise cannon shots, commanded Paris, and met the woman who would become central to his life. No parades, no grand speeches, just maps, manners, measured steps, and a calm cannonade that echoed through history. The year was 1798. France was once again in one of its classic situations, at war, full of politics, and unsure whether it loved or feared its own military heroes. At the center of this confusion stood Napoleon Bonaparte, now 28 years old, short-tempered, highly organized, and wearing a hat that had begun to earn respect on its own. Fresh off his victories in Italy, Napoleon was famous. People were writing songs about him. His face was showing up on plates. He was the guy you called when your country needed saving, or invading someone else. But back in Paris, the government, called the Directory, was starting to feel a bit nervous. Napoleon had fans, too many fans, the kind of fans who might say you should be in charge, which was dangerous for any group trying to stay in charge themselves, so they came up with an idea. Napoleon, they said, what if you took all your talent and went really far away? He nodded. Where? He asked. Egypt. He didn't blink. Egypt, why not? It was far. It was warm. It had pyramids, sand, and history. And most importantly, it gave Napoleon a chance to hit Britain where it hurt, their trade route to India. Britain at the time ruled the seas, but they also relied heavily on goods coming through Egypt and the Middle East. If France could mess with that, even just a little, it could throw a big wrench in British power. Napoleon agreed, but he didn't just want to fight. He wanted to explore, so when he packed for Egypt, he didn't just take soldiers. He brought engineers, artists, mathematicians, botanists, writers, and archaeologists. Almost 150 of them, a whole team of smart, curious people who would study Egypt while he tried to conquer it. Yes, it was technically a war expedition, but it was also kind of a school trip. The journey begins. Napoleon left France with a huge fleet, over 400 ships and around 35,000 men. They also brought camels eventually, horses, cannons, and probably more wool uniforms than were strictly necessary for the desert. The trip across the Mediterranean took weeks. Soldiers got seasick. Officers grumbled about the heat. Napoleon mostly stayed in his cabin reading about Alexander the Great, dreaming of becoming just as legendary, but with a better haircut. Along the way, they stopped at Malta, an island held by the Knights of St. John. Napoleon decided to take it. He knocked on the gates, gave them a stern look, and the knights gave up almost immediately. He took the island, reorganized it, gave a few speeches, and was back on the ship in a couple of days. No big deal. Then, finally, the fleet landed in Egypt, near Alexandria. It was early July. It was hot, very hot. Welcome to Egypt. Stepping off the boats, French soldiers were hit with heat, humidity, and sand. So much sand, many of them had never seen a desert before. Some tried walking barefoot. It did not go well. There were camels, big, grumpy camels. They smelled strange and made weird noises. Soldiers stared at them, confused. The camels stared back, unimpressed, but Napoleon didn't waste time. He marched his army inland. One of the first big battles came near Cairo against the Mamluks, elite Egyptian warriors known for their fancy horses, curved swords, and loud yelling. They were good fighters, proud, fast, fierce, but Napoleon had something they didn't: cannons, drums, and a love of geometric formations. He lined his troops up into massive squares, like giant, spiky Rubik's cubes made of muskets and bayonets. Every side could shoot, every corner could turn. The Mamluks charged in waves but couldn't break through. Napoleon's soldiers stood firm, fired in rhythm, and moved as one. The battle ended in a French victory. It was called the Battle of the Pyramids, even though the pyramids weren't actually right next to them, but Battle of the mostly flat open desert, not far from the pyramids, didn't sound quite as exciting. After the fight, Napoleon walked near the pyramids with his officers. He stared up at the massive stones, thousands of years old, and said something poetic like, "Soldiers from the heights of these pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon you," which sounded impressive, even though most of the soldiers were just squinting in the sun, wondering when lunch was. Cairo and culture, Napoleon took over Cairo, set up a local government, and tried to make friends with the people. He told them he came in peace. He printed announcements in Arabic. He learned a few words. It didn't really work. The Egyptians didn't trust the French, and let's be honest, being conquered by people who say we're your friends now doesn't exactly inspire confidence. Still, Napoleon had plans beyond war. He founded the Egyptian Institute of Sciences and Arts, a kind of science club in the middle of a desert. Here, French scholars studied everything: the Nile River, ancient ruins, plants and animals, local languages, mummies, which deeply fascinated the soldiers. They made maps. They took measurements. They even discovered something very important: the Rosetta Stone. This stone had the same text written in 3 different scripts: Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphs. It would later help scholars crack the code of ancient Egyptian writing, a mystery that had been unsolved for centuries. So even though Napoleon came with guns and uniforms, he also brought notebooks, and they made history in a quieter way. Then, disaster at sea. While Napoleon was busy building pyramids of paperwork, his ships were sitting quietly in the bay. This was a problem, because the British Navy, led by the fierce and clever Admiral Horatio Nelson, had been looking for them. Eventually, Nelson found the fleet at Abukir Bay, anchored and vulnerable. He attacked. The sky lit up with fire. Cannonballs smashed ships. The water boiled with debris. It became known as the Battle of the Nile, and the French fleet totally destroyed. Napoleon now had no way home. No ships, no reinforcements, just heat, sand, and thousands of confused soldiers. He pretended not to care. "We'll make Egypt our new France," he said. The soldiers nodded, then drank more warm water and swatted at mosquitoes. Also, plague. Around this time, another problem showed up. Plague, not metaphorical plague, real, actual, contagious, terrifying plague. People got sick, fast. Napoleon visited the sick himself, walking through the military hospital, pretending everything was fine. He touched one of the infected, which was bold, made a speech which no one remembers, and left. He didn't get sick. Just lucky, maybe. The army, however, was losing morale. Men were dying. Supplies were low. And to make things worse, the Syria situation, Napoleon, unable to sit still, decided to march his army north into Syria. He wanted to crush the remaining Mamluks and make sure the Ottoman Empire, who ruled the region, got the message: France is serious. But the campaign didn't go well. They fought battles, won a few, lost others. The desert was brutal. The heat was worse. Food was scarce, and plague followed them like a shadow. At Acre, they tried to take the city by force. It didn't fall after weeks of trying, digging trenches and facing stubborn defenders, and some help from British advisors inside the city. Napoleon finally gave up. He turned around, went back to Egypt. Tired, frustrated, a little thinner. The secret exit by late 1799. Napoleon knew the Egyptian mission wasn't going anywhere. He also heard whispers from Paris. The Directory was failing. The country was unstable again. So what did he do? He left, quietly slipped onto a ship and sailed back to France, leaving his army behind under another general, Most leaders would be fired for that. Napoleon, he got a parade. Because when he arrived in France, the people weren't mad. They didn't care about the fleet, or the plague, or the camels. They saw a hero, and Napoleon smiled, just a little, and thought, maybe it's time I ran this place, but that's for the next chapter. In 1799, after the whole sand, camels, pyramids, and plague adventure, Napoleon Bonaparte returned to France. The trip back wasn't exactly a vacation cruise. He sneaked away from Egypt quietly, leaving his army behind, hopped on one of the few remaining ships, and sailed back across the Mediterranean. When he got home, things weren't looking too great. The government called the Directory was a mess. Imagine a group of people who keep trying to run a country but keep tripping over their own rules and arguing about everything. That was France in 1799. Weak, confused, and kind of tired of itself. Napoleon wasn't much for long speeches or polite dinners. He saw an opportunity. France needed a strong leader, and maybe, just maybe, he could be that guy. So he started planning what would become known as the coup of 18 Brumaire. Now, before you imagine secret tunnels and wild battles in the streets, hold up. This coup was mostly paperwork. Yeah, it wasn't exactly a Hollywood-style storming, the palace kind of thing. It was more like a corporate takeover, but with more powdered wigs and fewer coffee breaks. Napoleon teamed up with a few key political players who were also fed up with the Directory's nonsense. Together, they cooked up a plan to push the old government aside and install a new system, one where Napoleon would be the boss. On November 9, 1799, which was the 18th of Brumaire in the French Revolutionary calendar, hence the name, Napoleon made his move. He and his allies convinced the Council of Ancients and the Council of 502 parts of the government to dissolve themselves and set up a provisional government. There were speeches, debates, and some tense moments. Some politicians tried to resist. Napoleon's brother Lucien, who was president of one of the councils, helped smooth things over with a bit of persuasion and maybe a few stern looks. Despite some grumbling and shouts of it's illegal, the coup went through. It wasn't messy, it wasn't violent, and it didn't involve any dramatic duels at dawn. And just like that, Napoleon became the most powerful man in France. He was named First Consul, a title that sounded fancy but also had the benefit of sounding less like a dictator and more like a friendly official. It was a smart move. Being First Consul sounded official, important, and above all, reasonable. Now, you might think that once Napoleon took power, he just sat back, relaxed, and let people bring him grapes on golden trays. Nope. What followed was a mountain of paperwork. Yes, paperwork. Running a country isn't just about winning battles and making speeches. There's taxes to organize, laws to rewrite, judges to appoint, armies to fund, roads to build, and people to keep reasonably happy. Napoleon had to deal with all of that. He spent long hours going through files, meeting with ministers, signing documents, and basically trying to make sense of the chaos left behind by the Directory. This was not the glamorous part of being in charge, but Napoleon took it seriously. He knew that to hold on to power, he had to be more than a war hero. He had to be a good administrator. During this time, he worked on reforming France's legal system, which eventually led to the famous Napoleonic Code, a set of laws that made things clearer and more fair for many citizens, and that still influences laws today. But that was a few years down the road. For now, he focused on stabilizing the government, calming the people, and building his power base. Of course, even while buried in paperwork, Napoleon didn't lose his confidence or charm. He was sharp, focused, and knew exactly how to use his reputation to get what he wanted. The coup might have been quiet, but its effects were huge. It marked the end of the French Revolution's chaotic phase and the start of Napoleon's rise to real power. From here, things would start moving fast. Napoleon wasn't just content being the guy who handed out orders from a desk. He was gearing up to reshape France and eventually Europe. But for now, he was the first consul, sitting behind a mountain of papers, signing his name again and again, and probably thinking about how much more fun it was to ride horses and plan battles than to shuffle paperwork. Still, this quiet moment of administration was necessary. Without it, none of his future conquests or reforms would have been possible. And so, with calm determination, Napoleon started his reign not with a bang, but with a pen. After taking control as first consul, Napoleon knew that winning battles wasn't enough to keep power. France had been through a lot: revolutions, wars, chaos, and the people wanted stability. They wanted their lives to work smoothly again. And that meant fixing the stuff that usually makes heads spin: taxes, money, laws, and religion. First up, the tax system. Before Napoleon, taxes in France were a mess. Imagine a neighborhood where everyone pays different amounts. Some sneak out of paying anything, and the tax collectors sometimes took more for themselves than the government. Yeah, it wasn't exactly fair or efficient. Napoleon decided to change that. He wanted taxes to be predictable, fair, and collected properly. So, he made sure the government had a better system to keep track of who owed what. Tax collectors were supervised, paperwork improved, and cheating got harder. This might sound boring, but it made a huge difference. When the government had steady income, it could pay soldiers, build roads, and keep things running. Next, Napoleon turned his attention to the money itself. France's economy needed a boost, but the currency was unstable. People didn't trust banks much anymore because of all the chaos in recent years. So in 1800, Napoleon created the Bank of France. This was a big deal. It wasn't just a place for rich people to hide their gold. It was designed to stabilize the currency, give loans to businesses, and help the government manage money better. The bank helped France feel more secure about its finances. People started trusting the money again, and the economy began to recover. But Napoleon knew that just fixing money and taxes wasn't enough. France also needed clear, organized laws. Before the revolution, the laws were a confusing patchwork. Different regions had different rules. Some laws were old and confusing. Some were unfair. It was a mess. So Napoleon ordered the creation of a new legal code. A set of laws everyone could understand, follow, and rely on. This would later become known as the Napoleonic Code. Writing this code took time. It wasn't something that happened overnight. A team of legal experts worked together, debating every detail, trying to balance tradition with new ideas from the revolution. The code covered everything: property rights, contracts, family laws, and even crime and punishment. It aimed to be clear, simple, and fair. For example, it promoted equality before the law, meaning everyone was supposed to be treated the same. It protected private property, and it set rules for marriage and divorce, which was a big deal at the time. But don't get the idea it was perfect. Some parts were strict, especially for women. They didn't get equal rights, which would be a problem for later generations. Still, the code was revolutionary. It helped unify France under one legal system and influenced many other countries too. While all this was going on, Napoleon also made a surprising move. He allowed Catholicism back into French public life. Remember, during the Revolution, the church had been attacked hard. Priests were kicked out, churches closed, and religion was seen as the enemy of progress. Napoleon understood that people still cared about their faith. Religion was important for social order and personal comfort. So, in 1001, he signed the Concord Act with the Pope. This agreement recognized Catholicism as the religion of the majority of French people, but kept the Church under the control of the state. It was a smart political move. It calmed tensions, brought back many religious people to support the government, and showed Napoleon as a leader who could balance tradition with change. In fact, balancing was something Napoleon had to do a lot. He was juggling between revolution ideals and old ways, between control and freedom, between power and peace. Sometimes it looked like walking on a tightrope over a pit of angry historians. He didn't always get it right, but he kept trying. By reforming the taxes, creating the bank, writing the code, and managing religion, Napoleon built a stronger France, one that could stand firm and proud after years of chaos, and he wasn't done yet. Because behind the scenes, while all this paperwork was happening, Napoleon was also thinking about Europe, how to protect France, how to expand influence, and how to make sure no one ever messed with his country again. But for now his focus was clear, making sure France's foundation was solid. A country needs money, laws, and a little faith. Napoleon gave France all three. In 1004, something big was about to happen in France. Napoleon Bonaparte, who had been the first consul and de facto leader of France for a few years, decided it was time to take things up a notch. He was going to become emperor. Now, you might think becoming an emperor is all grand entrances, fireworks, and armies marching in perfect lines with golden trumpets blaring from dawn until dusk. Well, sort of, but also not quite that dramatic. Napoleon wanted this ceremony to be important, but not too flashy. He liked things under control and didn't want the day to turn into a giant, never-ending party where everyone forgot why they were there in the first place. So, the preparations started at the famous Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. It was the perfect place, old, impressive, with lots of history. The French had done coronations there for centuries, so it felt right. On the big day, Pope Pius Roman VII was there. The Pope's presence was important because, traditionally, the Pope crowned monarchs. It gave the whole thing a religious blessing and a bit of extra legitimacy. The Pope was like the official seal on the paperwork, but Napoleon had a surprise up his sleeve. When it came time for the actual crowning moment, Napoleon didn't wait for the Pope to put the crown on his head. Instead, he took the crown himself and placed it firmly on his own head. Imagine the Pope ready to do the honors and Napoleon saying, "Thanks, but I got this." It was a bold move. Some say it was Napoleon's way of saying he owed his power to no one but himself, not even the Pope. Others just think he liked being in control. Either way, the crowd in the cathedral was stunned, but they clapped anyway. Napoleon's robes were heavy, really heavy. They were made of fine materials, decorated with gold embroidery and fleur-de-lis, the symbol of French royalty. Wearing those robes was like carrying a small, very fancy mattress on your shoulders all day. There were oaths to take, promises to protect the people, uphold laws, and rule fairly. There was incense burning, filling the air with a smoky, mysterious scent that made everyone feel like they were part of something special, and the Mass itself went on for quite a while, long enough that some of the guests started shifting in their seats and wondering if dinner would be ready soon. Despite the ceremony's length and weight, the French public was mostly okay with it. They had seen Napoleon rise from a Corsican baby to a military hero to the leader of France. Becoming emperor wasn't as shocking as it might sound. In fact, for many, it felt like a natural step. After years of revolution and instability, having a strong leader with a crown seemed like a way to bring order back. So, life went on. Paris buzzed with talk about the new emperor. People went back to their daily routines. The soldiers prepared for the next campaigns. The politicians started figuring out what this new emperor meant for their jobs and Napoleon. He smiled just a little under that heavy crown, knowing that now he wasn't just the man in charge. He was the man in charge. Once Napoleon was emperor, things didn't slow down. If anything, they sped up, especially when it came to war. Yep, war was basically Napoleon's full-time job for years and years. Europe wasn't exactly throwing a party at the time. Lots of countries didn't like how Napoleon was shaking things up. So, what happened? They teamed up more than once to try to stop him. These teams were called coalitions. Think of them like those group projects in school, where everyone's trying to get their own way, but instead of doing homework, they were trying to beat Napoleon on the battlefield. Napoleon faced several of these coalitions. Sometimes he fought one, sometimes 2 or 3 together. It was like an ongoing game of Risk, but with real soldiers and cannons. Despite all the challenges, Napoleon won many important battles. 3 stand out the most. First was Austerlitz in 1805. It's often called Napoleon's greatest victory. The battlefield was snowy, cold, and full of fog. Napoleon's troops tricked their enemies into thinking they were weaker than they really were. Then, boom, surprise attack. The Austrians and Russians got caught off guard, and Napoleon crushed them. This battle changed the map of Europe. Count